to Navigating the Four podcast, where we discuss all things faith, healing, leadership, and communication. Exploring the topic of communication, I'm Matt Barker, and I'm joined by the other hosts of the podcast, tackling the topic of faith. We have Freed-Hardeman Professor of Bible, Matt Cook.
Hey, guys.
Exploring the perspective of leadership, we have Assistant Dean of the Emerging and Innovative Programs at Freed-Hardeman, Mr. Jared Gott.
Hello.
And giving us a perspective of all things mental health, we have Director of the University Counseling Center at Freed-Hardeman, Mr. Nathan Judd.
Here I am.
All right, thanks for joining us for this episode of Navigating the Four, where we bring you real talk, fresh perspectives, and a few laughs along the way. Whether you're in the middle of figuring life out or just here for some good conversation, you're in the right place. So grab a seat, maybe a cup of coffee, and let's start navigating the four together. All right, welcome to Season 3, Episode 1. We're back for Season 3.
I was thinking
it's been a while.
Season 3.
Wow.
Look at us.
All the views keeping us going
No,
strong.
everybody's been telling us how much they've been enjoying it. We had to come back for another season of it.
We have like 3 or 4 strong fans.
They're
really want us to keep
they're
going.
dedicated fans.
Yeah.
Holding it down.
Yeah. So
Rick Epler hanging out there.
Shout out to Rick Hepler.
Shout out Rick.
He's a big supporter of our show. Matt Cook has been to different places, though, speaking, and people have told him they've enjoyed the podcast. So it spans outside of Henderson, Tennessee, everybody.
It is. It's been surprising.
International.
Anytime anybody says, hey, I've enjoyed your podcast.
Yep.
Really? Okay.
That's the same reply I have. It's a shock. Oh,
Who would have known? Who would have thought it? But Season 3, Episode 1, we're going to get into communicating across generation. We joke about this all the time. We think about how sometimes we have trouble communicating with those that are younger than us. All of us have close to teenage kids, if not, right before the teenage years. So the things they come home from school and talk about, or the way that they say things, how their day was, can be sometimes a little bit comical for us on how they say things. And we would say something totally different. So today's episode is really just getting into some of these things. And I want to start off with a game. I'm going to say some phrases and how that maybe us as hosts of this podcast would say things. And then we're going to get into how we think, let's just say maybe how our kids would say it, or Jared, you're a youth minister, so maybe how kids in the youth group would say things, okay? And there is kind of a right or wrong answer, I guess, but there can be maybe a little bit of an interpretation here for some of these. All right, let's start out with one that says, that was disappointing. Jared, what do you think? What do you think? If someone
why did you go to me first? This should be open-ended.
You're right across from me.
That was disappointing?
Yep.
Man, I don't know.
So this is what they would say.
This is what someone from another, like the younger generation, how they would say it. Yep.
I got you.
I mean, the immediate answer that came to mind was, I just hear the word crazy a lot.
They do say crazy. I don't know. Matt Cook, what do you think?
I do not have a clue.
I may have. Okay, that was cringe.
Oh, no.
No, that's not disappointing.
No.
It's embarrassing.
Oh, whoa. You said there could be more than one answer.
That's fair. Is it whack?
No. Oh, Jared's.
Thanks for saving
What is
me,
Jared?
man. I feel
Is
like
Jared
I
a
got
60-year-old?
thrown under the bus. I'm sitting with my cringe, though. That would fit in.
I think maybe. Yeah, that might work. I looked these up on ChatGPT just to
Great.
kind of give us. That was mid. You ever
I've
hear
heard mid?
Mid.
I've heard mid, yeah.
Okay.
Disappointing mid.
Yeah.
It's not great. All right, let's just do a couple more here. We won't go through all these here, but I actually like this more than I expected. I actually like this
I don't
more than
like
I
these
expected.
definitions. I have no clue what that would be. I actually like this more than I was expecting.
So they weren't expecting to like something, but they did. They would say, this is blank.
This is a little cringy what I'm about to say, but I think that was fire.
Okay,
good
yeah.
job.
So
I almost said that. Yeah.
But also low-key fire.
Low-key fire.
Because like if you weren't expecting to like something you do, hey, that was low-key fire.
I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this, I think I have heard my kids say high key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that
I think
means
that's
that you,
catching on, yeah.
that would
I
probably,
hear fire all the time.
that would mean like you were expecting to like it and you did, so it's high key. If you don't expect to like it and you do, that's low-key fire. Like, hey, it's kind of under the radar fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's do one more. I think
Am
this
I
is
2 for 2?
One for
1.5? Okay.
okay. No playing with the buttons. Okay. That's not impressive at all. There we go. That's not impressive at all.
That's not impressive.
I
at
mean,
all.
you could go with that's mid again.
Yeah.
Is it meh?
Meh.
Man. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that would probably work. We'll give you one. But it says that ain't hitting.
I've actually
never
never
heard that.
I haven't
Never heard
either.
it. Mm-mm.
But
That one's new to me.
Somebody's saying it.
Man,
ChatGPT.
If our kids hear this episode, the things that you're giving us right answers for, they're going to be like, no. Like,
Here's-
They're gonna be like, that was.
we
cringe.
need a kid here to
Here's
be
what
the
I
judge.
think. I think they're going to say
was
this
cringe.
episode is low key fire. I was not expecting it to be good,
That's
but
right.
it was. So that's what they're going to say.
Not so far.
It's not what my kids are going to say, but that maybe is what other people are going to say. All right, here we go. This is really, really good.
Wait, that's not what
Fire. That's fire.
I think that would work. What they put is
Did they put bussin'?
they put bussin'.
Bussin'.
Okay.
That was bussin', which
with
I
you.
don't think people use that as much anymore, right?
My
Do people
kids
still say
do.
bussin'?
My kids use it.
It's been a
I
minute.
feel like the more adults use it, the more kids don't use it. So this one's pretty easy. I'm staying in my lane,
Oh yeah, minding my business.
minding my own business.
Will you define 6'7" for our listeners, Matt?
No idea.
Okay.
What is what?
Do you know?
I have a
No.
gag. I have a gag with my kids. It's driving them crazy because I'm making it go way longer than it should. But I act like I have no idea that 6'7" is even a thing.
So really,
See how that works? It drives my kids crazy.
but basically, what we're talking about today is generations communicate differently depending on their culture, their background, what generation they grew up in. It's an important thing to talk about, not only for just our communication, but our faith, those we interact with at church, leadership, mental health, all those things. I think it fits for all the different categories we talk about on this podcast. And different generations often mean the same thing, but say it differently, like that game we just played. The phrases that we use can mean one thing to one generation, something completely different. I want to kind of mention, too, this isn't about roasting another generation. You hear a lot of times say, I don't understand the younger generation because they don't communicate the same way I do. It's really just about getting a better understanding, I think, of how we can maybe communicate better with those that are not from the same generation that we are. So it's not about, we're not here to roast the younger generation about the way that they talk. It's really just coming to a better understanding of that and having some real conversation about sometimes how miscommunication can occur and maybe some practical ways to communicate better, right? Which is what we're all trying to do in our different areas that we interact with people. So first question here, we'll start out with Matt Cook. How have you seen generational differences in communication either strengthen or strain faith, whether in families, churches, or spiritual conversations?
Yeah, so the differences are real. And I mean, you think about in your church context, think about a teenager and then somebody who's 80 years old and the drastic difference in the way they communicate. You got the kid who's staring at their phone pretty regularly, pretty often, and that person from the older generation who just wants to sit and talk and will sit and talk for a long time sometimes. And so kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. And then I'd read somewhere that Gen Z, they are often, and I've been here before where I thought somebody from Gen Z didn't like me. But turns out they're just short in their conversations. They're kind of, let's have the conversation, get it done. They're very efficient. And so you can see how all these different generations can kind of hurt each other's feelings if they're not careful. So yeah, this is a big deal. And if we don't learn to do this well, we're going to have problems. Do you want me to answer the biblical perspective?
Yeah.
Was that a part of the question?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the Bible does have something to say about this. Two passages that I'd point out real quick. The first one is Colossians 4, verse 6. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. I think talking about intergenerational communication and learning to communicate intergenerationally is taking this verse serious. It's saying, okay, I want to know how to answer each person in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that doesn't offend them, and in a way that they can hear and understand clearly. So I think that verse is pretty key. And then as a missions professor, I love 1 Corinthians 9. We become all things to all people, right? But I love that he adds, we do it for the sake of the gospel. And so if you're like, I don't really care how other groups communicate, I'm going to communicate my way, then maybe I could like take the highest level and say, okay, will you do this for the sake of the gospel? Because we're not going to be able to communicate in Christ-like ways or communicate this good news that we share if we're not taking it seriously to communicate with people from other generations in ways that makes sense to them the best.
Yeah, and it's probably difficult too as a minister in a congregation full of different cultures and generations to speak the language that everyone can understand, I would think, because you have teenagers in there, you have adults, and typically when you hear the typical preacher talk, it's very much maybe to the older generation, and you don't always have preachers that are saying things like we talked about at the beginning. So to some of the audience might not reach them. So it's probably difficult, I would think, as a minister to do that. So
yeah, even just 6, 7, right? When it first was going on, I'd occasionally throw in a little joke, and then I'd have to say, like, okay, the old people have no clue what's happening. Like the youth group's going crazy and like going doing the hand motions and all this, and like the old people are just staring at me because they don't have a clue. So even just little things, inside jokes with different generations, only makes sense with one generation.
I was thinking about this actually last night. We have started a weekly class on Monday nights that focuses on personal evangelism. And so last night we had a class on it, and the idea was like qualities or characteristics of somebody who is actively engaging as a soul winner, right? And the reference point was John 4 and Jesus and the woman at the well. And one of the points was a soul winner is a good listener, right? Kind of hearing where people are at in their story and in their faith. And so the question came up of what qualities make a good listener. And there was a certain generation who answered the question from their perspective of what makes a good listener, right? Not always on your phone, right? Eye contact. And I thought, you're not saying anything incorrect, right? But there is a whole another generation who's also in the room who it doesn't bother them. They still feel like they are listening, and in many cases are listening to one another, even though they're not doing some of those things. So I think there are some, general guidelines of this helps with communication. Certainly eye contact helps with communication. We're all looking at one another right now as we're doing this. I don't know that it applies the same way. I think there is each generation will carve out, this is the expectation, right? And then it becomes difficult to get them to connect when they're not all following the same expectation that the generation before them has.
Yeah. Nathan, what do you think?
Well, what's coming up for me is just difference in kind of old school versus new school of like sharing information / truth versus weighing in on someone's emotions and paying more attention to that. And I think old school likes to just not worry about if this is going to hurt their feelings. You hear the saying, say the truth in love. And I'm not saying we shouldn't say the truth in love. I'm not saying that's wrong. But I think a lot of the younger generations are so focused on an emotional experience more so than what the information is. I think both are important. So
Absolutely.
And it happens just so quickly, like the misunderstanding. I'm going to pick, I don't know whose class it was, but that word soul winner, like that to me rings like old school. And like, for me, it's like, ooh, I'm not going to use that word because that has a connotation to me that doesn't fit. But I think people who are older, that word just, it doesn't have a negative connotation. But like, I think even for younger generations, like soul winner, that sounds pretty arrogant right there.
And the speaker even indicated like this is a term that got used a lot more in previous generations, right? I'm just borrowing it and trying to sort of use it to describe what the goal is. Understanding it's a bit of an archaic term.
I like what Matt said because a lot of times we don't fully understand the way that other generations communicate. He mentioned something about people listen in different ways and they communicate in different ways, and we don't always understand it. It made me think about, I had a student one time thought they hated my class, and at the end of the semester it was like my favorite class of the semester, and I was like, I never saw you look up or do anything. And like Jared said, they were soaking in information that I didn't even realize they were listening because they didn't listen in the way that we were expected to listen when I was growing up, like making eye contact, not being on other things while people were communicating. So it's interesting to kind of think about what's the norm for each culture or each generation, what is acceptable. So one of the things I thought about from a faith standpoint is, remember in Matthew chapter 13, verses 54 to 57, where they talk about, isn't this the carpenter's son, talking about Jesus? Some people still see you as the young person that you were, especially if you grew up in a church and you're still there as an adult. We hear about preachers preaching at the church they grew up in, and it's sometimes hard for us to communicate in a faith setting with people that we saw from an early age. So that's the thing that popped into my mind was like, how does intergenerational communication affect those? A lot of times we tend to see people the way we want to see them, and that might be the way they were growing up. And a lot of times you don't necessarily, that's not always the best impression. So we have to kind of be willing to look at things in a different way and look at them how they are now and not necessarily how they were as a younger child. Just like in Matthew 13, some people were still not accepting of Jesus because they looked at him as the son of Mary, the carpenter's son, and these are his brothers. He's just a normal person. He's not the person that's doing these things. We tend to sometimes look at other people that way as well, and that's kind of what I was thinking of there. The second one was, where do you think generational miscommunication causes the most hurt, and what does healing look like when these misunderstandings are finally addressed? This is kind of more of a mental health question here. So Nathan, what do you think on that one?
What's coming first to my mind is the differences in communication, like on cell phones. I even called it a cell phone. Wow. Edit that out.
Mobile device.
Yeah, a telephone. But I've heard stories. I refuse to go. I don't use emojis. I'm like refusing to go there. But like people click that like button to say I'm acknowledging that I saw this, and all right, okay. You know, I'm like I don't want to click like. I don't know what that is, but I'm holding on to that.
Yeah.
But even like the younger generation is so focused on the punctuation, and so like if I were to say okay period, they're like, are you upset with me?
Right.
Whereas I could say okay exclamation point, and they're like, everything's good. Like that is such a small thing that I think those of us who are a little older don't even think much about a punctuation, but it speaks volumes in the younger generation. And I think that's something that I'm having to adapt to. Like I could try to hold on to the old school ways on that one, but I don't think it's worth it.
Yeah. You mentioned this earlier in the first question, Nathan, and I think it's very true. One generation values emotional transparency, whereas the older generation, if you're like our parents' age, for example, or even us to some extent, well, we don't need to talk about that. We need to hold back some of that stuff that's kind of emotional, and we don't need to talk about that. I'm just going to push through. You know, I'm going to handle this myself, and I'm not going to bother other people with this. And you see now more of the younger generation, they're a little bit more open about, I'm struggling with this. I need help with this. Maybe a lot more people that are younger generation are going to see a counselor and talking through some of those things. Maybe the older generation is like, no, I'm going to handle that myself. I don't need to bother anybody else with my problems. And that can be, from a communication standpoint, that can cause a lot of issues if you don't talk about it, if you try to hold it in. But it's just, I think that's a generation thing too. Our parents and those that are older were taught growing up, again, back to the social norms, we don't talk about those things. We don't express our feelings in this way. We're just going to push through and try our best to get through it on our own and not really bother anybody else. So that's kind of what came to my mind.
I think some of that comes from just maturity as we get older and a shift in perspective too, right? There are things that I think I could say for each of us sitting around the table, there are things that happen in our lives where it's like, that's bothersome. But I have a perspective that other people are dealing with things that are potentially worse or, you know, just as frustrating or, you know, they're under the same amount of pressure. So I don't necessarily feel a need to have to talk through that. I feel like I can handle this, right? Like I feel like this is within my ability to handle. Whereas there are things that we look at, probably each of us with our own kids, right? We have those moments where they're dealing with what they believe is a problem, a crisis in the moment. And it's, you know, we have that perspective, that age of saying like, that's internally, right? That's not a big deal.
Yeah.
That's going to be something you won't even remember in a few months, but it is the biggest deal they might have encountered that day
at
or that
time,
school year. Right. And so that's a hard thing to keep front of mind when you're talking to different generations. And I think there are, you know, I used to get upset at older church members who would say things to our youth group. And I'm like, why do you even need to bring that up? Why even address that or address it in the way? And maybe they could have picked a different tactic, right? But understanding, as I've gotten older, some of them, they were very concerned about that individual, right? Like it wasn't, they were trying to be nitpicky or tacky about something. They had a real concern about that individual's faith, soul, however you want to say it, and felt like I need to address this right now. That probably makes sense, you know, as they're older and they're thinking about what limited time there is and, you know, friends of theirs who they have regrets about not addressing things with. So I think there's just a perspective shift in how people handle things given where they're at in life.
Yeah, kind of to piggyback off what you guys have said, I think if a younger generation is more open and sincere, maybe one of the hurtful things that happens is when the older generation is dismissive of that authenticity. And I think even at our age, it's easy for us to look at, you know, people in their early 20s, college students, who to us it comes across as a little soft or a little like, oh, come on, get over it. And I think when we verbalize that or even by our facial expressions indicate that we think this is ridiculous, that can be pretty hurtful. Kind of on the opposite extreme, I think of an older generation that there's something about when people get old, they think they have the right to say whatever they want to. And that's not cool. And I think, and I've said that in sermons. Just because you've reached a certain age does not mean the rest of Scripture all of a sudden doesn't apply to you, and you can say whatever you want to whoever you want. So, that can be really hurtful. I think about the divide between generations when an older person just spouts off their mouth because they think they can. That's pretty hurtful and can be problematic.
Yeah. Season our words. Yeah, that applies to everybody, not just, it doesn't disqualify you if you're an older as well. Let's think about it from a leadership perspective, Jared. We'll start with you on this one. From a leadership standpoint, what happens when leaders refuse to adapt how they communicate across generations, and maybe what positive changes could we see if they do try to do that?
Okay, so the first question is, what happens when leaders refuse to adapt? That one's easy to answer. Communication just doesn't happen. Right? When leaders don't adapt, they lose the ability to effectively communicate across those generational lines. That's it. Or they encounter such frustrations in trying to communicate across those generational lines that they actually end up causing more harm than good. So then the second question is, what positive change can occur when they do adapt? Often, not only does communication happen, but as we were just talking about, they do become a more effective leader by adding that extra layer of perspective or appreciation or understanding of who they're trying to communicate with. And then it enhances their approach and their communication ongoing when they're dealing with different generations.
Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, this is tough because most of us in leadership positions are communicating to people from across generations. So as soon as I say, okay, I'm going to adjust for this, well, then I lose another. I lose another generation. And so I've constantly got to be aware of who I'm speaking to and adjust accordingly. And if I've got a classroom of college students, like I have most days of the week, if I'm not adjusting the way I communicate to them, then like Jared said, communication isn't happening. They'll tune me out immediately. But if I'm then, I heard somebody say they were going across the street to speak at the widows' luncheon at the church. Like speaking to that context, I better adjust I cannot speak to them the way I speak to a classroom of 20-year-olds. And so it's constant adjustment. Yeah, and it's tricky. I lean towards, like, when I'm communicating, I'm going to do my best to communicate to the younger generation and trust that the older generation is spiritually mature enough to acknowledge that if we're going to reach a younger generation, we've got to communicate with them. Of course, they're not always mature enough for that, but that's kind of my approach.
Before we leave that, I think there's also an element of that everyone, I think, understands, but I want to make sure that people do understand. When you're making those adjustments, it is possible to adjust to your detriment, right? If I suddenly adapt all the lingo that we just played with at the beginning of this podcast, it's going to become the most inauthentic thing.
That's right.
Right? And so I'm going to immediately lose any crowd. If I ever use any of those terms, I like over enunciate them so they know, like,
exactly.
This is what a ridiculous older man.
Yes.
Right? When I'm using those, to try to become all things to all people in your communication leads to you not effectively communicating with anyone.
Yeah.
Right? So there's got to be a sincerity and an authenticity and somewhat a transparency in becoming relevant to different groups, but not losing yourself in that process.
Yeah, you can look foolish in a real hurry.
Absolutely.
Either direction. I mean, I even think with an older crowd, I could all of a sudden turn on more of a preacher voice and start talking like the preachers that they remembered from 30, 40 years ago. I'm going to look just as foolish like that too.
Yeah.
It's real sus. I was
Well done.
Yeah, thank you.
That was a fire answer.
Yeah,
right
yeah,
there.
I thought so. Low-key, yeah. Jared and I are on it. I was thinking a similar thing, Jared. Like, I think if I'm with a particular audience, knowing how to speak to them in a way that's going to connect with them is important. But if I've got a very broad audience, I'm probably going to lean into being true to me and how I communicate, and hopefully I'm just going to try to be very clear in the communication and make sure I don't leave anything hanging out there that could be misunderstood as much as I can do. And also there was another question earlier about, like, how can healing happen when misunderstandings happen, and I think again, communication. If I go to someone and say, hey, this is how I received what you said, can we talk about that? That'll clear things up more often than not if we're open to having those conversations.
Yeah, when I was thinking about this question about leadership, I was thinking kind of in a I guess, a working environment. You have different people that are in authority positions, bosses or whatever. I was thinking about how maybe the difference is in those that dealt with employees that are older compared to those that are younger. And I think a lot of that has to do with how the bosses or those in positions of authority listen to their employees. And it goes back to the question we talked about with emotional transparency. I feel like if you were to ask like our parents or the older generation, it's a little bit more transactional when you're in a working environment. Well, I have to do my job. And if I do my job effectively, I'm going to get paid and everything's going to be great. I think now we're seeing more and more with the younger generation, bosses have to not only you have to do this job, but you need to tell me if you're upset about something. We need to figure out a way to work through this. Whereas if you were to talk to the older generation, like it didn't matter if I was upset or not, I had to push through, work through it. And that's what I'm there for, to get paid and do my job. It's more transactional as a means to an end. And now what we see is you have to be a little bit more in tune to that than maybe our parents' generation was, or maybe even our generation, where these are things that are expected of you, whether you like it or not, you got to do it. And to some extent, the younger generation has to do that too. It's not like they're excused from that. There are certain things that have to get done in a job. But as far as reaching your employees, you have to maybe be a little more in tune to, well, how do the employees feel about this? I'm going to include them on some of these decisions to make sure they're in the know so they don't feel like totally blindsided by a decision that's made. Whereas before, maybe that wasn't considered as much. And I think too, I don't know, I have any research necessarily to back this up, but I think the younger generation, if they don't like something, might be a little more willing to, I'll find another job where they do value me. I'm going to go somewhere where they include me on these decisions because this place doesn't. They don't appreciate me. I don't appreciate them. And we might see more with the older generation. Well, whether they appreciate me or not, this is my job. I need to be committed to this job. I need to stick it out and do the best I can. And if you see people stay places 40 years, even if they're miserable, right? And now you might see more of a shift where, well, if I don't like what I'm getting here, I'm going to go somewhere else. So if you have a very qualified employee that you're not really in tune to the emotions and different things they're experiencing, you might lose a great employee that you're just not reaching in the way you need to because you're not really thinking about some of those generational things too. So whether that's a good thing or not, I think that's something that bosses and people that are in charge in different businesses or organizations probably have to consider a little more than maybe they used to. The last one here, talking about communication, I'll start this one off. What's one communication habit every generation needs to relearn if we want to actually understand each other in different generations better? Mine wasn't anything to do with actually talking. It's more about listening. I think we talked about this in the last question a little bit, but the listening styles of different generations can be vastly different. I think probably if you were to speak to an older generation, they're very much more give me the information I need, and I'm going to listen to the information I need and maybe disregard the things I don't need to. Now we see a lot more listeners being more relational oriented where, okay, what are you telling me? But also, how do you feel about this? What are some of the emotions you're bringing to the table? And we've talked before, earlier in the podcast, some of the older generation and even us aren't as good at picking up on some of those emotions that people are talking about. We're looking at it more from a black and white standpoint. This is what you're experiencing. This is how you fix it, right? And more and more we're seeing with our listening, that's something that I think we have to revisit and relearn a little bit and say, this generation, maybe it's our kids, we need to listen in this way and figure out like not just what they're telling us, but maybe what are some of the emotions they're going through when they're telling us this. Even like Jared said and Matt, it might seem silly to us that they're going through this, but if we're looking at it more from their perspective and from an emotional standpoint, we're better able to kind of help them for what they need and not necessarily how we would handle it, but look at it from their point of view. I think is maybe important to look at. That's kind of what I thought of. Jared, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually have two, even though you told us to only pick one. One is I wish that each generation would learn to take the initiative in communication, right? I think too often each generation is waiting for the other to accommodate and make the move to improve communication, which leads to no communication. And so, we're painting with broad brushes here, right? Like there are individuals I know of from all generations who will be the ones to help lead in communication. But as a whole, if people wouldn't wait for someone else to meet them where they're at, right, and could adapt a little humility in I'm going to be the awkward one, right, for the betterment of us both, then I think it would help a lot with communication. And the second piece of that, and you just touched on it a little bit, Matt, is the extension of grace in communication and understanding that none of us are going to get it perfect with each person. We're all going to do something that may be perceived as a slight or may be perceived as somewhat not inappropriate, but just sort of
maybe not sensitive to what they're feeling.
Insensitive. That's fine. We're all going to do the thing that just gives somebody pause, and that's okay, right? And appreciate that someone is trying to make an effort. So actually, humility and grace.
Yeah, I like that, because not only, it may not be that we're not trying to communicate intergenerationally. We may just be having a bad day.
Right.
Or we may just be tired, and I'm short with everybody that particular day. And so grace and patience. I would say here, every generation needs to learn how, and I'm not talking about like face-to-face. I'm talking about learn how to use the different modes of communication and know when it's appropriate to use those modes of communication. There's an appropriate time for a text. There's an appropriate time for an email, or kind of in between text and email, a Facebook message.
Yeah.
There's an appropriate time for a phone call, and there's an appropriate time for a face-to-face meeting. And perhaps the younger generation needs to know, okay, this is not text worthy. I actually need to call this person on the phone and talk to them, or I need to go see them. The older generation probably could say, okay, not everything needs a phone call. And I'll admit, I probably lean younger here. I don't like talking on the phone. Yeah. And so if you're inviting me to, or need me to do something, just text me or email me. Why do we have to? I love the messages that are like, hey, could I give you got any free time? Could I give you a call? I want to talk to you about something. And it's usually somebody my age, and it's like, I even know what you want to talk. Just email me. Ask me to do this thing. I do not want to talk on the phone. But then I also need to remember there are generations that like they prefer to communicate like that on the phone. And so I need to be patient, but I think all of us can learn the different modes of communication and when they're appropriate.
What's coming up for me is there's a skill that I work on with people. And I'm not saying this is something you have to do all the time, but when you're in one of those conversations, it's a little bit more risky. And there's a whole thing I do in counseling sessions with this, but the idea is that I have one person share, and then the other person says, what I hear you saying is blank. And then at the end of that, is that right? And then the person will either say, yes, that's right, or no, actually what I was saying is this. Oh, I'm sorry. What I hear you saying now is this. Because what happens in those tense conversations when our emotions are up, a lot of times we'll hear something different than it is intended. And then we keep going on, and we're not on the same wavelength, and it just keeps derailing worse and worse. So slowing down and clarifying that you're on the same page, I think that's a really good habit.
Yeah. I don't know about you guys, but I thought this episode was pretty low key fire. It turned out okay. Sorry, I had to go there. If there was a joke, sorry. All right, thanks for joining us today on Navigating the Four. We hope today's conversation sparked something real in your faith, your healing, your leadership, or your communication. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to subscribe, share it with a friend, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep showing up, keep growing, and keep navigating the four. We'll see you next time on Navigating the Four podcast.
Season 3 is going to be lit.